Greetings, everyone. This is Richard Solomon with Taking Care of Business. And to start our show today, I'm going to give you a little hint on what the topic's all about.
Send lawyers, guns, and money.
That's right. That's Warren Zevon.
Dad, get me out of this.
All right, lawyers, guns, and money. Now, as you probably know, I'm an attorney, and I have times when I need a lot of support in crisis communication or other lawyers or communications people. So I actually have one of the perfect people to talk to and to educate all of us about what to do when Warren Zevon, who of blessed memory, talk about lawyers, guns, and money. Well, sometimes lawyers and money are not enough. And the guns aren't going to do you any good. So I have Tom Vogel from JConnelly. So thank you for being here. And we have him at the station. And so let's talk. There is.
Thanks for having me, by the way.
Love having you.
Thrilled to be here.
So there is a never. Before we even get into all the minutiae, because I could see this is a great topic. Everybody has to have an emergency Rolodex. You got to have, your surgeon. You got to have an accountant. You got to have a forensic accountant. You have to have a bail bondsman. You have to have all the kinds of people to call in the event of an emergency situation. You're supposed to have your go bag. You're supposed to have, 3 days of food in cans and a barrel of water and all this other stuff and solar, a crank radio. But what do you do when something really bad happens or there's some kind of extraordinary circumstance, such as cyber attack, something that shows up in social media, a video of something embarrassing, a criminal activity, even if you're the victim of the criminal activity, or someone in your staff is on the news because they've been cuffed and taken out at 6 o'clock in the morning. And everybody's, hey, that's Joe. Oh, man, that's Joe on the news. And then, of course, the switchboard's ringing, and then the people who are there don't know how to necessarily respond to that. The lawyers generally dummy up, and they either say no comment, which looks bad, or they're not prepared because they're not really they're lawyers. They may be professional speakers, but they're not crisis communicators. So you need to have somebody like Tom. You need to have his business card like literally in your pocket because at some point you're going to need to call. So how did you actually get into the business of crisis communication management and all that good stuff? Because, when you look at Wikipedia, there's no picture of you.
Well, I hope not. Well, I got dropped into it. I got dropped right into it. I was a journalist for a long time, worked for the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg. And I think some of the best practitioners of crisis communications are people who are very familiar with journalism because that's you're dealing with, the media. My first client was a company in Brazil. I was invited to meet with the board, the chairman, the CEO, for an issue that I won't get into all the details, but involves some of the things that you're talking about. And I got thrown right in. I was planning to get into PR. I thought about PR as a business, but crisis communications is basically managing your message with the media when everybody wants to talk to you. Speaking about Warren Zevon, one of my favorite stories about crisis communications, it goes back, it's a film, Larry Flint versus, what was it called?
The People versus Larry Flint.
People versus Larry Flint, exactly. And there's a scene there that I always think about when it comes to crisis communications that Edward Norton is playing his attorney, and Larry Flint is going up into his plane, and Norton is trying to quit as his attorney. And Woody Harrelson playing Larry Flint said, "What you can't quit. I'm rich, and I'm always in trouble. I'm the perfect client." Well, the thing is that, unfortunately, there are very few people like Larry Flint in the world who ended up taking his case to the Supreme Court, First Amendment rights. There are very few people like that who have the money and time. Most people can't, and companies can't stand that kind of damage over a long period of time. And that's where someone like me comes in.
Especially because most people don't realize that one major component of litigation is that it's a war of attrition. It's attrition of energy, time, money, personnel. A large-scale litigation can divert the time and attention from productivity to what is essentially a regressive activity. Because people improperly think of litigation as an asset And if anything, it's nothing but downside and risk for both sides, the people bringing the case or advancing it, or the people defending it. It's just not a good proposition. And what's interesting is how the court system lets things just drag on, and cases get a life of their own, and the lawyers just sort of, it's just matter of fact to them because it's one of 1,000 cases, even if it's big. And I think one of the things that we need to do, I guess this is my preaching here, is that once the court system realizes that litigation has got to change in order to improve commerce, then commerce will improve dramatically.
Well, here's the thing. If you're a company with a brand, you got to think about the war, not the battle. I mean, you might win the battle, but you'll lose the war. Go with the news recently. United Airlines has been in the news. Not a company that we've worked with, but I'm just going on what I've read. And they, at the beginning, seemed to be wanting to win a battle, but they lost sight of the longer-term objective, which was their brand. The CEO came out with one message which seemed to defend his employees and forgot that, there are other stakeholders besides your employees and besides your stockholders and besides your board of directors, and those are your customers. And you got to think about all those groups. None of those groups are unimportant. They're all important. But you can't just address one of them. You have to think about all of them in everything you say. You have to assume that anything you say to one group is going to be shared with the others, which is exactly what happened with United. I think the CEO put out a memo to the employees, which was immediately shared with the media, and he might as well have given it to the media. Unfortunately, he'd only addressed one audience with his message there. If he had thought, hey, I have other audiences to address here, he may have taken a different approach.
Well, that's the problem, because when people are in crisis mode, they tend to be very polarized, very defensive, very limited in their expectation of what the horizon is. They don't know what the horizon is. So I guess, you want to look to your employees as, I got you back. See, I got you back. So
exactly.
even though the situation is, although it's viral, don't worry, we have your back. But having your back means that the guy that's on the computer about to book the trip to, Florida says, I'm not sure I want to take brand A airline if they're yanking people out and calling the cops and roughing them up.
Exactly. Exactly. And to be fair to United, and we talked about this before we the broadcast.
In pre-production, as they say.
In pre-production. This isn't an issue unique to United, to be fair.
Sure.
Because of social media, as we discussed, these incidents tend to be, you see one incident, and that obviously was a horrible thing that happened with that passenger, that doctor who was dragged off. Not that happens every day, but now you're starting to see more and more with not just with United, but other airlines, things that have happened. And suddenly it seems like, we have an epidemic of issues with the airlines, which may be bigger than the actual problem. But perception with the airlines right now, that's the problem. You could be a CEO of any of these airlines and come out and go, well, it's one passenger out of however many 100,000 that have an issue, but it doesn't matter because that's the one everybody's looking at.
Well, I'm going to quote my brother. My brother says something like along these lines. If only one person was killed in Central Park all of last year, was it a good person? Was it a good year? And it depends on whether you were the person,
Exactly.
So it's all perspective. Now, the airlines have taken such a hit because between 9/11 and all of that stuff, continuing today, they've had lots of issues, and you just don't need, as a company to keep fighting the hits. There's sort of almost like, brand resilience fatigue. Mm-hmm. You can only come back so much. Mm-hmm. You can only explain so much. Mm-hmm. You can only reinvent yourself so much before people are like, taking the train. Really,
Well, if the train was more economical, I would take it, actually. But that's another issue with Amtrak and the federal government. We'll talk about that on another broadcast.
That's another guy. All right. So if I am a business, or I am the leader of a business, I need to probably sit down with you and say, okay, today is not the rainy day, but what does my rainy day fund look like? Not money-wise, but intellectually. What does it look like? Mm-hmm. What do I need to know? What should I have ready so that, if there's some kind of problem, you're on my speed dial on my cell phone. I call you. What do you need, and what do I need to provide? What is all the prep that we need to do now for that rainy day? And hopefully it never comes, but just like people have title insurance, health insurance, disability insurance, fire insurance, theft insurance, you're like another kind of insurance.
Mm-hmm. And like any kind of insurance, you have to take this analogy a little bit further. When you buy insurance, what do you have? You have an inventory of what you're insuring, what matters to you, right? So when it comes to your reputation, and yes, having the card of my company, or one of our many unnamed competitors, is helpful, but not enough. What you need to have in place is a plan for dealing with, let's say, the top 4 or 5 most likely scenarios of trouble that could hit your company, or you as an individual, if you're a high-profile individual. You can't plan for everything, but by planning for the top 4 to 5, you can use what you've put together for those situations for others. Another thing is protocols. What are we going to do when something goes wrong? What is our policy when media calls us? Generally, that would be take a name and number and pass it on to someone at the company who we've already established is going to take those calls. A team. Who's going to be involved in the crisis communications team? Usually CEO, COO, CFO, head of marketing and communications, and your internal legal counsel. Those are generally the people that are involved, as well as, I hasten to add, your external legal counsel.
Oh, yeah.
Depending what the issue is.
Sometimes it's local counsel.
Exactly.
Sometimes it's specialized counsel.
And you want them involved from the very beginning. Now, I know that the job for lawyers oftentimes is to say no in terms of sharing information. But at the same time, and we work with lawyers in most crisis communication shops, work with lawyers, internal, external counsel all the time. But you need to have them involved from the very beginning. Another thing is a FAQ or a Q&A, let's call it. Those 4 or 5 situations that are likely to hit your company or the most likely crisis situations you might face. For each one of those, a Q&A in terms of, and this is something you would put together when the crisis comes up, and it's an evolving document, and it's not necessarily an external document, but something internally used for all your messaging. Maybe you share it, maybe you don't, so that everybody who's involved knows what happened, why it happened, when it happened, and so on. One of the biggest problems that happened in a crisis is that, as we saw with Volkswagen and some other companies, is that they didn't have a whole holistic view of exactly what had happened. So sometimes a company will come up, we rush to go out and say, well, that couldn't have happened, or this is not correct, and da-da-da-da. But they don't have all the facts. And they're not trying to mislead people, but it looks like they're trying to mislead people if they try to rush out and make a statement before they have all the facts together. It's an investment of time in the beginning. It's actually one of the most important things that any company or individual can do when they're in a crisis, is to have that Q&A together. It's not something that's ever a final document. You're always adding to it. But it's something that everybody who's going to who might be in a crisis situation or is in one should have handy.
So let me ask you a philosophy question. Does the CEO spend more time dealing with the crisis, or do they spend more time managing the crisis? Because, the criticism could be, oh, there's Rich Solomon on the phone, with the media, and he should be doing, he should be explaining why the radio station burnt down,
Exactly.
Or something like that. In other words, because sometimes you can be criticized because, you're there and the media is looking at you, but it's like, yeah, that's nice, but maybe somebody else should be doing that and you should be fixing the problem or, whatever. So what is your philosophy on something like that, which is who's the face and who is necessarily managing? Because maybe sometimes you can't do them both, especially like, let's say there's something like an environmental disaster. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you want the guy who's at the helm to be sort of explaining the disaster as opposed to calling every resource and asset to contain it and fix it as possible because it's continuing and brutal, something like that. What's your philosophy on that?
If it's a crisis that is enough to hurt the brand of a company immediately and over the long term, the person speaking needs to be the top person of that company. If it's anybody else, people will say, well, where is the guy or the woman, the man or woman?
We mean guy generically, yeah.
That's in charge of this company. If they're not out there speaking, it it looks like they're not being a leader. It looks like they're not taking responsibility. That needs to be the person. But, part of being a head of a company is also delegating, right? You need to delegate to others all the aspects of actually managing the crisis. But the spokesperson needs to be the CEO, president, founder.
All right. So when you have a team, because I assume you put together teams of people when you get called for a crisis. And like Peter Phelps, remember in Mission Impossible, he'd sit there and put together the Mission Impossible team, and he'd get, Roland Hand because he did something. He got Barbara Bain because she did something. You got, Greg Morris because he was like the electronics guy, So do you have like different people that you assemble that have different kinds of expertise, and then they become part of the crisis management communications team?
No, yes. We have someone to manage a team, someone like myself. We'll also have someone who's looking at social media, and we'll have content. I call them content, but pieces people are putting together messaging, the first drafts, which we'll review along with the company on how to respond to certain situations. And we'll also, here's another part of the team that's actually really important, is the media that you plan to deal with. They're actually part of your team, and you should already know as a company who are the media that cover you that are most important. And you should already be in touch with them and have a relationship with them before anything bad happens. I actually consider them, in a very important way, part of a crisis communications team, broadly defined.
All right, this is Richard Solomon with my very special guest, Tom Vogel. And if you want to go to the internet to JConnelly, and that's exactly spell it JConnelly.com. They have offices in New York and New Jersey. And we'll be back after this. And if you're planning for a crisis, you can send an email now. We'll get you hooked up. All right, so we'll be right back after this quick break. All right. Welcome back. Richard Solomon, Tom Vogel. We are giving you the tips and inside strategies on crisis communication. Well, actually, Tom is, because I'm just a radio guy here. As a lawyer, all I can tell you is lawyers tend to stay away from these topics because they're so focused more on the legal issues and not admitting or denying anything that can get you jammed up later, which is why you actually need people who know how to do this professionally. So let's talk about some great behind the scenes viewpoints. Let's kind of great stories, some insights, from real life, because people love that. I know that in pre-production you were giving me some great examples. Why don't we just flesh out a couple of them?
Well, one of a client that I had was a state regulator, let's put it that way, who needed to become involved in a very large company and that had done some things they weren't supposed to do, that had lots and lots of clients and assets, like billions and billions of dollars. I like to talk about this particular client for one reason, for many reasons, but the main one being that he planned ahead. This does not happen very often. Unfortunately, the nature of a crisis and the way they unfold, some companies have something in place, most don't. And in my business, we usually get called in when, 2 or 3 alarms of a 4 or 5 alarm fire have already gone off.
The picture is the building is on fire, it's going down the river, and the cliff is 3 feet away, and they're calling you at that point.
Exactly. Which it's and I don't want to make light of the situations that I'm helping my clients with, but one of the reasons I got into this business is because I find it very satisfying to come into a situation like that and be helpful. I mean, I like most jobs people get into, there's a sense of personal fulfillment that comes from that, being able to come into a situation where literally people feel like their hair is on fire and they don't know what to do. They've kind of lost a little bit of perspective because they're so panicked.
The law is like that because you have people who have, maybe business-threatening conditions. They're a little paralyzed. Maybe there's a very big lawsuit. Maybe there's a lot on the line. Maybe it's intellectual properties on the line, or who owns a building. Mm-hmm. There's winner-take-all kind of stuff, and they need somebody to both comfort them and guide them and reassure them. as much as, handle the legal matters.
Exactly. And there's a phenomenon that one of my colleagues, Ray Hennessy, our Chief Innovation Officer at JConnelly, came up with. This was a phenomenon, and I'm paraphrasing here, but being too close to the mirror, in the sense
it fogs.
Well, there's that. It gets fogged up, and you can't. And because you are so close to the problem, which might be, I'm not necessarily saying it's you yourself, a client, but you're so close to it, you don't have perspective. This client that I'm talking about was a regulator that was intervening in a very large company, and also a lawyer. And he decided that he needed to have somebody else take a look at things, and he did this. He had the luxury of time. He knew that there was a legal action that he was going to have to take. It was going to be very unpopular, and also very high profile and affect a lot of people. And he wanted someone else's perspective. And unlike many of my clients, I'm not speaking bad of our clients, but he had the luxury of being able to plan ahead. And one of the first things he did was call a crisis communications firm that I worked at. And we worked for 2 or 3 months to put together a plan on how to address the rolling out of what they were going to do. And what happened, because he planned ahead and because he, in a sense, moved away from the mirror and asked for somebody else's perspective, something that could have been far more controversial ended up not being that controversial at all, actually, because we had already, and this goes back to what I was talking about preparing. In the last segment, we talked a little bit about, and I'm not calling the media members of a crisis team, but they are a stakeholder, and you should look at them not as adversaries necessarily, but as, well, players. Let's put it that way.
They're components.
They're
definitely
components.
Yeah, they're components of a larger scale endeavor.
Right. And hey, some journalists will be on your side, others won't, but they all have the same job to do. And most of the time it's not personal. 99 out of 100 times it's not a personal, it's not. They want a good story. That's what it's about. If you want to be prepared for a crisis, one of the smartest things to do, in addition to the other things we discussed, having a plan, having a team, doing the Q&A, hypothetical situations, chain of command, protocols, one of the most smartest things to do is to develop a relationship with what I call lead steers.
And what's that?
A lead steer is, and I don't know if this actually is correct with steers and cattle herding, but I'm going with it.
We're from New York.
We're from New York.
No,
so
there
we go. Well, lead steer or lead steers, these are journalists that other journalists look to and say, okay, that guy knows what he's doing and covering this company. So you don't need to reach out to every single journalist, every single publication that covers you. You only need to reach out and have relationships with a handful of them. It could be half a dozen, maybe 10. 10's a lot. We're talking like 5 or 6 journalists. Have relationships with those journalists so that, and when I say have a relationship, what I mean is you're telling about the company as much, depending on whether you're public or private, what kind of stories you want to tell them. Maybe they're writing about you, maybe they're not. But you want to know these journalists so that when the time comes and something does go sideways or you need to explain, you already have that kind of, let me put it, rapport with these journalists. The last time you want to reach out to a journalist is when you need to reach out to a journalist. One of the things I like to tell my clients, and JConnelly, we tell all our clients that all the time, because if you're calling out to them when, the metaphorical plane has gone down, and that's the
sometimes
first
it's not
time,
metaphorical.
and sometimes it's not metaphorical, that's absolutely the wrong time to be developing a relationship with a journalist. I was a journalist for a long time. I have the relationship part of is so important. It's not just the story of your company, but it's the journalist knowing who represents that company. I get calls all the time from journalists for various clients who they may call me up and ask me about something completely unrelated to the client that I'm representing. But I know that if I give them a ring and say, hey, something really important going on with my client, maybe coming out in the news the next couple of days or tomorrow in the next 5 minutes, may not be very positive, but I want you to know this is what's happened and give you the inside story, so to speak, so that when you do write your story, you have all the facts straight.
All right. That leads me to a question.
Mm-hmm.
Having dealt with the media, first as I'm a member of the media, but having dealt with the media, I've actually found that even well-intentioned journalists, because of time constraints, resource issues, complexity, sometimes don't get the story right. Not because of the spin on the story. I'm just talking about like they'll say, what is this case about? Sometimes the case is really complicated and you can't soundbite it perfectly. But when you try to explain what the case is about, they'll say, oh, this case is about that. I'm like, it's really not about that. It's like the other day, I was in a litigation, and this wasn't a crisis communication, but somebody in the paper said, this is about real estate. And I wrote in response, it's not about real estate. It's about the escrow agreement regarding real estate was sold, but the real estate sold and gone. It's about the escrow, which is it's a 2-page agreement. This case isn't about terra firma. It's about 2 pieces of paper. So, and that's the problem. Sometimes people don't really get what the gist of it is. How do you deal with that, especially when it's hard to correct people and say, "Hey, Joe, it's not about that." You didn't get it. It's like, hey, that's not it at all. Like, how do you do that? Like, how do you correct people, even though they were well intentioned, they didn't get the story, and the story went to press, and you read it and you go, oh, that wasn't it at all. You missed the tag.
That's a very good. Okay, so a couple of things I want to talk about from what you just spoke of. One, there are a lot fewer journalists covering a lot more news under a lot more pressure and a lot less time. Yep. And it's not because they're bad people or they're not smart. It's just that they literally do not have the time, and news organizations do not have the resources to dedicate to covering stories, now versus like they did 5-10 years ago. Thousands of jobs lost, a lot more journalists under a lot more pressure.
With a faster news cycle.
And a faster news cycle. This is why, going back to what I mentioned before, having the relationship with these journalists so they know you, they know your company, know what you're about, before you even get to this point, why it's so important. And you know what? It's not just public companies, also private companies. I mean, it's maybe journalists, maybe nobody's writing about your company, and maybe the people that run your company are not interested in getting media or getting coverage. Fine. But maybe they want to be quoted somewhere. That's a way in with journalists to at least have a relationship, so a head of a company can be commenting on a trend in the sector, but establish themselves as reliable sources and make sure that the journalists who do cover them, and like I said, we're talking 5, 6, 7, 8 lead steers, that will help a lot in avoiding those kinds of problems. And if you have that kind of relationship, you're in a much better position to be able to go back to the journalist afterwards and say, hey,
you missed the tag.
Yeah, you missed this. Actually, it wasn't this way. It was that way. And you know what? It's as much a company's or someone like me, it's much my responsibility to get it right and explaining to the journalist and framing it properly as it is for the journalist to understand it. But a big part of a job of in crisis communications is explaining this stuff to journalists, not assuming that they know everything, because they don't. You have to give them that information. It's not about spinning. I mean, that's a word that people use. I'm going to spin the story this way and spin it that way. Yes, people go out and do their research. They'll come up with different opinions. But I want to be able to provide context to these journalists for each story and links to other sources that aren't the company I'm representing. It's like, well, by the way, it's not just us. Other people are saying the same thing. Becoming a resource to journalists, very important. Not just to sell your company's story or to sell your company's version of the story when there's a crisis, but to help it make it easier for a journalist to actually report it. Because like I said, limited time, limited resources, and whatever you can do to make their job easier will pay off, not just in terms of a story that's more accurate, but in generating goodwill and credibility with that journalist.
Let me give you an example of something I deal with all the time. Go to court, and you have 3 feet of paper, and the other side has, an equal amount of 3 feet of paper. The judge looks at you and says, what is this about, right? Now, everybody spent a month creating these papers. They've been proofed. They've been researched. There's cases. Now, what happens is the court doesn't read any of this. And I'm sorry, but that's the truth. They don't read anything. They go by sound bites. So they'll say, what is this about? And it's always like, he owes me money. And it's like, and then they look at you and it's like, no, they breached the contract. I mean, it's always like, but it oversimplifies the problem, because in the rush to get to an immediate bottom line, so much is lost. And that's what I always find very troublesome about the court system, because it's like, look, they spent a month writing those papers that I don't agree with. And then I wrote these papers that maybe they don't agree with either, but all of us put a lot of time into this, and nobody's reading anything. And you just want to get a soundbite, because there's a courtroom of 400 people that all need sound bites to be processed in order for justice to move forward. And just like you said, that the journalists don't have the time, the resources, and the news cycle. Court system under too much pressure to move cases along, and they can't really babysit everybody. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with the fact that you need to get more than a soundbite out there, and it's got to be something that's robust but simple at the same time?
Your job sounds a lot like mine.
It is.
I just realized.
The more you talk, the more like, I do that. That's exactly what I do. Maybe that's why I understand your business so well.
Well, there's, I mean, listen, the essence of journalism is taking that big pile of papers and boiling it down into a message, right? A story. I think the way of coming at it is try to put yourself in the judge's head, or in my case, in the editor or journalist's head. What is a journalist's goal in writing a story? It's newsworthy, it's relevant, I've got all the facts. What your client thinks is important isn't often the same thing as what a journalist thinks is important. So with our clients, what we try to do is be an advocate, be like, in a way, a devil's advocate for our clients, in the sense that I'm talking to a client about how we want to get our message out, and I play the role of a journalist. And I go, well, this is the first question they're going to ask, like, why should I care? Or, what do you mean? Like, how do you support that assertion? And I try with my clients, and I'm sure you do with yours, to find I mean, at the beginning of every legal document, there's not every
preamble,
right? And you have this summary, right? Like the first filing, right? The first 3 or 4 pages, right? Which is still about 3 or 4 pages too long for my purposes as a journalist, but it's probably just a small percentage of the larger document. I try to, and using this as an analogy with lawyers, I try to come up with a way of telling the story that concisely, as you do in the first part of a lawsuit. Why are we doing this? I try to get our clients to see it from a journalist's perspective. How can we describe the story that way to a journalist? Because you have to, and if you can't, let me put it this way: if you don't tell your story, someone else will, and this is your chance to tell your story in your words. Don't let someone else do it for you.
All right. So we're going to do this when we come back, but I want to definitely talk about sort of corporate things that need to be dealt with in the public image. Remember when Coca-Cola said, hey, we're going to change the formula. After 150 years, we're going to improve everything. Mm-hmm. And that turned out to be not the greatest idea. And then we've talked in pre-production about some other stuff that I'll save for all the listeners. But let's talk about that in the next segment. You are listening to Richard Solomon. We are with Tom Vogel, who's the senior vice president, but to me, he's the big macha. All right, he's the big macha of JConnelly, JConnelly.com. They've got a cool website. These are the people that you need to have in your Rolodex for crisis communication, crisis management, and plan ahead. That's all I can say is plan ahead. All right, we'll be right back right after this. All right, speaking of time for a change. Wasn't that perfect? Wasn't that perfect? And that was Van Morrison singing Domino. So we are going to talk about dominoes.
Exactly.
Because we talked about this in pre-production. And this is Richard Solomon, Tom Vogel, Crisis Communication. He's from JConnelly, JConnelly.com. People you need to know. People who I now need to know. All right. So that was Van Morrison singing Domino. So today's been like rock and roll, rock and roll music. Let's talk about the Domino story, because you love that story. So talk about it.
Well, and if you haven't seen it, look it up online. Bloomberg Business Week had a fabulous cover story about Domino's Pizza. This is the reason why I find this story like my favorite as of now, crisis communications, crisis strategy story. Domino's about 10 years ago had a reputation, a little bit less than 10 years ago. They did some studies and they realized they had a reputation for not having really good pizza. And if your business is selling pizza and people think, your pizza doesn't taste great, that's a major problem. Big problem.
Well, it's kind of interesting. Like, you'd see a Domino's and across the street would be like the local pizza people, Gino's, Nick's, Ray, whatever. And you always say to yourself, how does Domino's compete against the local guy who, it's a mom and pop business. They're there, making the pizza, and looks a little bit more authentic in the non-chain store. And I always say, how does Domino compete with that? Because they both deliver, and and there's the same geographic zone. So how does Domino's beat that? How does Domino's compete?
Well, they were, and I'm not going to cite the storyline and verse, but basically they had done surveys and discovered that if people knew it was a Domino's pizza, they were more likely to not like it, just knowing it was a Domino's pizza.
Wow.
and if your business is selling pizza, that's absolutely the worst place you can possibly be, right? What they did was, I would call it almost radical transparency. They decided to address this in a very public way, through an ad campaign, through surveys, through commercials, basically using the complaints about their pizza and then talking about what they were doing to make it different, make it better. And they were so transparent in how they dealt with sort of these perceptions about the quality of their pizza. They became so good at it that now, whenever there's kind of an issue that comes up with people, with some story about Domino's, there's an issue with, there's even a viral video about something horrible somebody did, that was never, on a pizza that was never delivered, right? But they become so good at it that it's now become sort of a strength of theirs and how they address whenever anything comes up about quality of their product. The company went from, and let me grab the magazine here because it has the numbers are right here, but I think it was bought for $1 billion by a private equity firm, and now it's worth, 9 or 10 times that amount. But this is at the center.
That's amazing. Bread, water, sauce, and cheese is worth $10 billion.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. But they, and I love the story because one of the things that we try to do at JConnelly is look at a crisis not just as something to defend yourself from or fight against, but look at it as an opportunity to reaffirm the values, the vision of your company or your product. Domino's said, our product is pizza, and you, clients, customers are saying, we're not doing a good job, so this is what we're going to do to make it better. It's taking very seriously what their business was, their vision, and also taking very seriously their customers. In a lot of our crisis work, we look at as a crisis or a sensitive situation, however you want to phrase it, as an opportunity to reaffirm everything that you started this company for, why you do what you do, and the value of your service. I think people buy into the story of, or are moved by the story of like, hey, we stumbled, we made a mistake, and now we're going to make it right. Who doesn't like that story?
That's a real American thing.
Exactly.
People like resurrection, underdog. It's like Rocky. You want to come back,
right?
Beat up a little bit in Rocky 2. So right. Rocky 3, you're okay.
And you know what? It goes back also to some of the preparation for, facing a crisis, is knowing what your vision is to come. What are your values? Because when a crisis comes up, that's an opportunity to say, We may have stumbled. We may have made a mistake, but we're going to do better. And we're going back to, what we stand for. Speaking of which, I got to mention a couple of other recent. I actually was reminded of one of my other favorite sort of crisis communications sort of strategies. It was, and this is the only time I'm going to mention politics, but Obamacare, when it came out, as you remember, when they launched the website,
Didn't work.
Yeah. Right. And
they spent a lot of money putting it together.
I spent a lot of money putting it together. That's another, but without, so what, and I had completely forgotten this until like a couple weeks ago. I started looking up. I love Zach Galifianakis in Between Two Ferns. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but highly recommend it. Look it up. It's sort of a parody of a talk show with Zach Galifianakis, a comedian, asking sort of obtuse, obnoxious questions of famous people. And President Obama got on the show a little bit after the Obamacare, Affordable Health Care Act, the websites weren't working, and allowed Zach Galifianakis to sort of give him a hard time. And then also respond that, well, yes, hasn't worked out as well as we thought at the beginning, but we're working on it and we're fixing it. So he came back being very transparent, humble even, and funny, but owning the story and owning the problem. Another one of my favorite ones was the Red Cross. I don't know if you remember this, but last year there was an employee of the Red Cross that tweeted something out about them having a big party and drinking a lot of beer, and it went out on the Red Cross Twitter account. It was not meant to go out to. It was supposed to be a direct message, I think. Red Cross took it down. And then put up a tweet afterwards saying, we took down the tweet. We're sorry. We've taken the keys away from this employee. But they came back in a very funny way, and it was appropriate. I mean, humor is not always a good idea. Often it isn't. It can easily be
but it can break
misinterpreted.
tension.
Right. And used in the right way. It's and you have to be careful because like anything else, something that's written out can be interpreted different ways than something that's spoken. You see a tweet saying one thing, and it sounds very different than when someone actually says it to you. But another one that sort of comes to mind is sort of a bad, and I'm going back to, and this was last year. I remember this very clearly with Ryan Lochte. I don't know if you remember with the Olympics. He was a swimmer who claimed he told his mother he got mugged.
He got mugged? Yeah. Yeah.
He told his mother he got mugged, and then his mother said it on air. And it suddenly became a story for Brazilians, an incredibly sensitive story for Brazilians. We're very sensitive about there being any kind of crime around the Olympics. And here's a swimmer saying, I got mugged. Of course, it came out later that
he wasn't mugged.
He hadn't been mugged. But what I take away from that story is never lie to your mother. But if he had sort of been straight from the very beginning, you know what? We had a few drinks. We acted like idiots. He wouldn't have lost the sponsorships. He wouldn't have had the big issue that he had. The crime was in the cover-up, right? In a sense, not a crime, but the problem was in the cover-up.
Right, but isn't that always the case that people's first reaction is what do they say? Deny until you die, kind of thing. And it seems like all your success stories were the mea culpa stories, which is all right, yeah, all right, we screwed up, okay, all right, we did, but now we're working on it.
Right.
Because all your examples were like that, and that's more humane and human than never happened.
Exactly. But I also want to mention another thing. I was like, every crisis is different, and we have worked in plenty of situations where engaging the media in providing more information could make a story much bigger than it has to be. There is a value in considering how aggressive you want to be in your response and how should I put it? How concise you want to be in a response. Oftentimes, and we've had clients, and I want to throw this out there because I'm not saying that the response to every crisis is to go out there and do a mea culpa, because not every crisis requires one, first of all.
The lawyers may not permit it.
Right, lawyers may not permit it. But, I don't think that, beating our breasts and saying I've made a mistake Not every crisis requires that, or even there may not have even been a mistake made. But you need to weigh your response, also considering over the long term, am I going to make this an even bigger story by not responding or by responding? Sometimes it's depending on the level of coverage, it's a better idea to let sleeping dogs lie and not engage in a very aggressive way. Not always the best idea. Oftentimes, usually it is, but I've plenty of situations with clients who we've advised, you know what, let's see how this plays out before we get involved in sort of making statements to the media. Sometimes it's not a good idea. Most of the times it is a good idea, but not always.
So what do you do in the following situations? Because there's sort of mixed avenues. There's the press release, which is very old school. There's social media, which is sort of the newer thing. Mm-hmm. The media, which is kind of in the middle. How do you decide when to sidestep the media and just go straight to social media and try to get your message straight across, either because the media is hostile or it's too technical, or you need to do something that's beyond the soundbite, or you need to present maybe something more complicated, like your own video or something much larger. I know in one litigation we had this thing where we created our own counter, commercial to something that was being played in the press. And I was looking at what these people did. I was like, wow, that was pretty good. But no one would have published it because it's sort of like it was too much work and effort for the media to do it, so we had to do it.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's some people call that creating a counter narrative. I'm not a fan of the term counter narrative. It sounds a little.
It's the other side.
It's the other side of the story. Narrative is
the other side of the story.
The other side of the story. That's the way I prefer to. I mean, you hear that counter narrative. I prefer to say the other side of the story. And yeah, I think there's a value in that. I think there's a value in doing that through social media. Through your own content you had published elsewhere, through your Facebook, LinkedIn, whatever. I think there's a value to that. But I also think that, whether you're getting along with the media that are covering you or not, the most number of eyes are still going to be on those stories that are published by those publications. Yeah. I mean, you could have one of the, you could be like, have one of the biggest Twitter followings ever. But when you look at, search engine optimization results online, what you're going to see more often than not is that the stories that are published by the media that you may or may not be getting along with, those are going to be showing up in the Google results. Those are going to get a lot more play. You still want to figure out a way, like I said, begin by developing relationships with the top 5 or 6 lead steers that cover your company or cover you if you're a high-profile individual. And when these situations come up, you'll be in a better position to tell your story. It's not going to mean that doesn't mean that they're going to write the story you want, which is another thing. We should probably take a step back and mention that. Crisis communications isn't about just getting your message out. It's getting the best version of your story into the stories that people are writing. What I mean by that is journalists, their job isn't to write the story that you want them to write. Our job in crisis communications is to try to manage those stories to get as clear and most accurate version of what happened into those stories. But it doesn't mean that story is going to come out and be positive. The client that I mentioned earlier in the broadcast, the state regulator, one of his goals was to not be perceived as being being a bad person or making the wrong decision. He knew that there was going to be negative comments about him. He knew that not every story was going to come out saying this was the right thing to do. His goal, which was realistic, was I want them to at least be accurate about what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it. They can question the decision about why we did this and whether we should do it another way or not. But most important to him was that it be accurate. And that should be the goal. Whether people agree with your decision, whether you've made the right decision or not, that's another thing. But the goal should be being accurate, getting your version of the story out there.
All right. So in the very small time we have left, what are the major takeaways for people who've either missed it or we didn't cover in this very fast-paced hour of radio? What are the takeaways that people need for understanding crisis communication, crisis management, engaging the right professionals and dealing with sort of the media. What are the in the 2 minutes we have left, the takeaways?
Okay. 1, plan ahead. 2, have a chain of command in a small group of your firm that are the ones that are going to be managing the crisis. There's going to be the CEO, probably the COO, CFO, head of marketing, communications, internal and external counsel. An agreement amongst those people and all employees in general that any media queries that you receive are forwarded to a specific individual. No responses. Whether it's a crisis or not, actually. You should only have certain people speaking for your company anyway. Lead steers. Develop relationships with the top 5 or 6 journalists that cover your company. Hypothetical situations. Come up with a plan for 5 of the most likely crises that you think your company could face. You're not going to be able to come up with all of them, but you can have you can use those as templates for other crises that might be similar to those. And Q&A. When a crisis comes up, one of the most important things to do is the who, what, where, when, and why of that crisis for your own information and for your external counsel. It's a document that will be updated throughout the crisis that you can use for further communications, but more important is to make sure that everybody's on the same page about what happened, why it happened, and what we're doing next. So there's no confusion about next steps or what happened.
All right. That was the fastest hour of radio. It really was. We have 45 seconds. What is the most rewarding thing about what you do in the end? You know, in 45 seconds, like, what's the kind of moment for you? In crisis communications, it's oftentimes the opposite of PR. It's a subset of public relations. In public relations, we spend a lot of our time trying to get people to write about our clients. Crisis communications, you already have people calling you, and they already have the wrong idea about your client, and you're trying to provide them the story. And one of the most satisfying moments I've had, and it's more than one, is when a client, one in particular, who had lost his job because some stories had been written about him, and the stories were planted by an anonymous source who ended up himself getting in a lot of trouble. We were able to actually get a story out. It was literally his side of the story, for people to see that, no, this bad story that had come out about him wasn't correct. He shouldn't have lost his job. This doesn't always happen. It was a huge win, but it was incredibly satisfying because it helped him in terms of being able to get his next job and to convince everyone that what this person had said in the media about him was totally wrong. All right. Richard Solomon, thank you for that. We have to thank Karina for putting this all together.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for that, and we'll see you all next week. Tom Vogel, JConnelly.com. Thanks for listening.